Lake Ullswater is in the northwest of England, in a well-known area called the Lake District. It's a popular destination for families, who often visit to take photos and enjoy nature in the summer. The Lake District has mild weather, with frequent clouds, and the summers aren't too hot. This makes it a favorite spot for hikers. Sylvia, who lives near Lake Ullswater, is one of these hikers. She loves nature and hiking, often heading out in June and July when the weather is warm but not too hot. Every weekend, she packs her things in a backpack and hikes in the woods near the lake. Sylvia's good friend George also enjoys hiking. He often joins her on her hikes. Last weekend, they decided to hike near Lake Ullswater, but their hike turned into a very unusual excursion. Sylvia and George met at the start of the walk. "Hi, Sylvia," George shouted from a distance. "Hello, George," Sylvia called back. "I'll be right there." George ran towards Sylvia. "George, slow down. You'll get tired," Sylvia warned. "Don't worry, I brought energy drinks for the hike," George said, pointing to his large backpack and laughing. The two friends were happy to see each other, chatted briefly, and then started their hike. After a few miles, the path split into two directions. "Which way should we go, left or right?" Sylvia asked. "Let's go left," George replied. "Well, I think I'd prefer to go right," Sylvia said. "Why?" George asked. Sylvia looked at the woods near the left path and then said, "There are stories about that path. Some people have seen a big, hairy creature there." "Really? Do you believe those stories?" George asked. "I'm not sure. Maybe we could try it," Sylvia said, looking worried. "Come on, Sylvia. Let's give it a go." George encouraged her. Sylvia hesitated but eventually agreed, and they walked down the left path. An hour later, they were still walking down the path, surrounded by trees. It was late afternoon. Sylvia turned to George and asked, "Do you think there are strange creatures in these woods?" "I don't think so," George replied. "Why not?" Sylvia asked. "Well, I've never seen any strange creatures." "Have you?" George answered. "Not in these woods," Sylvia said. "Right, so we're safe," George said. Sylvia laughed, and they continued their hike. Several miles later, they emerged from the woods and found themselves at the edge of the lake. They spotted a house nearby, an old wooden structure. "Look, George," Sylvia called out. "There's a house." "Oh, I see it. Let's go check it out," George replied. "What if someone's there?" Sylvia asked. "Don't worry, Sylvia. I'm sure no one's there," George reassured her. They walked towards the house and looked around. "It looks like it's been here for a long time," Sylvia said. "Look at the windows. The glass is so old. And the wood is really weathered." "Yeah, I'd say it's at least 50 years old," George said. "But it's not ugly. There's something about it that I like." Suddenly, George called out, "Hey, Sylvia! Look at this." Near the lake, there was a small wooden boat in the water. "Let's get in," George suggested. "Are you serious?" Sylvia replied. "Why? We can row out to the middle of the lake," George said. "I don't know." Sylvia hesitated. "Come on. It'll be fun," George insisted. "Okay," Sylvia said, still uncertain. They climbed into the boat with their backpacks and slowly rowed out into the middle of the lake. Sylvia looked around. "It's so peaceful here," she said. "Yeah, I know. The trees are beautiful, and we can still see the sun perfectly," George replied. "I'm so glad we came out here. Let's have something to eat." "Do you want some?" Sylvia asked. Of course. What do you have? George replied. Sylvia pulled out cookies and sandwiches from her backpack, and George took out some energy drinks. The sandwiches look good, George said. Help yourself, Sylvia said. They ate their sandwiches in the boat. Then, suddenly, they heard a noise. Did you hear that? George asked. Yes, I did, Sylvia replied, sounding worried. I think it's coming from the house, Sylvia said. So do I, George said. Let's go check it out. Sylvia looked at him in surprise. Seriously, she asked. Yes. Come on, George urged. They rowed back to shore, grabbed their backpacks, and walked toward the old wooden house. I want to go inside, George said. Why? Aren't we supposed to be hiking, out in the fresh air? Not inside a house, Sylvia asked. I know, but I like exploring interesting places, George explained. I'm not sure, Sylvia said, unsure. Come on. Let's just go inside, George suggested. Finally, Sylvia agreed. They took a few steps toward the house, opened the door, and went inside. Everything was very old and dusty. It was clear no one had lived there for a long time. Sylvia, look at this, George called. His voice sounded strange. What? Sylvia asked. Look by the window, George said. Sylvia looked down at the floor, where large footprints were visible in the dust. What do you think these could be? George asked. I think they're bear tracks, Sylvia replied. A bear. There aren't any bears around here. The closest bears are hundreds of miles away, George said. Then I have no idea, Sylvia said, feeling uneasy. Let's get out of here. Suddenly, they heard a noise coming from the kitchen. Sylvia and George ran to the room. They couldn't believe their eyes. A large, hairy creature was standing in the kitchen. It quickly turned, went out the back door, and ran away, making a lot of noise as it broke the door. The creature disappeared into the woods. Sylvia and George stood frozen, unable to speak. What was that? George asked. They had no idea. Did you see that, Sylvia? George said. Yes, Sylvia answered. What was it? I don't know. But it was huge and ugly. Yeah, like some kind of creature. George looked at Sylvia and said, Let's go after it. Are you kidding? Sylvia replied. No way. Come on. We're here to explore. Let's follow it. Oh, George. I don't know about this. George and Sylvia left the old house and followed the creature's footprints into the woods. They looked around. Finally, George said, The creature could be anywhere. We'll need to split up. Split up? Sylvia asked, surprised. Are you crazy, George? There's a strange creature out here. And we have no idea where it is. I know, George said. But we could take a picture of it. We might even be on the news. What? Come on, Sylvia, George continued. Maybe it's a special animal. Maybe no one's ever photographed it before. They might write an article about us. Maybe I'll be interviewed for the TV news. We could. Stop. You're crazy, George. I shouldn't encourage you, but fine. Let's split up then. George went one way. Sylvia went the other. Sylvia saw no sign of the creature. She thought about it more, and in the end, she came to a simple conclusion. She and George had imagined the creature. It wasn't real. A few minutes later, Sylvia saw George in the woods. It was almost dark. She told him her conclusion, that the creature wasn't real. George disagreed. He was sure it was real. They just needed to prove it. Suddenly, George spotted a thicket of trees. He wanted to see if the creature was inside. He told Sylvia to wait while he went into the thicket. He smiled and waved as he entered. Sylvia waited for George to come back. She waited for several minutes. No George. She waited almost half an hour. Still no George. Sylvia looked at her mobile phone. It had no service. She couldn't even call for help. At this point, she was scared. But she couldn't just leave George. Then she had a thought. Maybe he went back to the house. Maybe this was all a joke. Sylvia walked back to the old house and looked around. No George. She decided to wait. If this was a joke, she could joke too. She'd act like it wasn't a big deal that he was missing. That would be fun. There was an old bed in the main room. She sat down and took out a sandwich. She ate it and thought about George. Where was he? What could she do? As Sylvia thought, she started to feel sleepy. Her head was heavy. What a day! I'll just wait for George here and... That was her last thought before she fell asleep. Sylvia woke up early the next day. George still wasn't there. She had hoped it was all a dream, but now she realized it wasn't. She was really worried. Maybe this wasn't a joke. Sylvia decided to go to the nearest town. She walked back along the same path. At last, she came to a small town. Though it was a Sunday, there were still several people around. Sylvia tried her mobile phone again. Still no service. None. She needed a phone. Sylvia went to a nearby restaurant. There were lots of people there. Sylvia didn't know what to say. It was such an unusual situation. Finally, she decided not to say anything. She went to the owner and said, "Hello, can I use your phone, please?" "Of course you can. It's on the wall over there." "Thank you very much." Sylvia first called George's number. His phone didn't ring. Maybe there was a problem with it? Next, she called George's house. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Why didn't anybody answer? George's brother was usually home in the morning. Not today. Sylvia called again, but still no answer. She left a message. "Where are you, George?" Sylvia left the restaurant and stood on the street for several minutes, thinking. Sylvia was an independent woman. She thought things through. Then she decided, let's figure this out. Maybe George had gotten lost in the thicket, and when he came out, I was gone. So he must have gone home. That's it. Sylvia decided she had to get back to George's house. She ran back to the restaurant and called a taxi. 30 minutes later, she arrived at George's house. "That'll be £9, the driver said. "Here's £10, Sylvia said. "Keep the change." "Thank you. Have a good day." Sylvia got out of the taxi and walked toward George's house. The house was large and beautiful, with 2 floors and a garden. It was in a nice neighborhood with big houses and shops all around. George's car was parked outside the house. Was George inside? Had he called his family? Sylvia checked her mobile phone. She had service now, but there were no messages. She called George again, leaving a message saying she was worried and asking him to contact her right away. I don't understand, Sylvia thought. George drove his car home. So why hasn't he called me? She rang the doorbell. No answer. She rang again, 3 times, but still no answer. Sylvia was getting concerned. She went to the house of her 2 friends, Claudia and Veronica. But they weren't home either. She tried calling them. Their phones were turned off. Something strange was going on. She just didn't know what. All her friends had disappeared. Sylvia didn't know what to do. She didn't want to contact the police. She knew George was safe because his car was home. There were no friends around to ask for help. Sylvia decided she would find George herself. By now, it was late afternoon, so Sylvia took another taxi back to Lake Ullswater. She walked the path into the woods near the cabin. After a few minutes, she saw the old wooden house. But this time, she noticed something different. There were lights on in the house. Sylvia could not believe it. "There are lights on in the house," she cried. She followed the path down to the lake and walked toward the house. It was late afternoon, but she definitely saw orange lights inside. She walked around the outside of the house, trying to get a glimpse of who was inside. It must be George. "Hello," she shouted. "It's Sylvia." No one answered. Suddenly, a noise came from within the house. "Okay, George," Sylvia thought. "This isn't funny anymore." She went to the door and opened it. She was totally unprepared for what she saw. Everyone she knew was there. There were so many people inside the house. Her mother, other family members, even her friends Claudia and Veronica. "Sylvia," her mother shouted. "I'm so glad you're here." "Hello," Sylvia said cautiously. "What's going on?" "Well," said her mother, "sit down. Let me explain." Sylvia sat down on the old bed. "What's happening?" she finally asked. Everyone around her looked worried. No one said anything. "Where's Dad?" she asked her mother. "He's at work." "He's coming soon," her mother answered. Sylvia looked around the room. "Can someone please tell me what's going on?" she asked. Sylvia's mother stood up and started to talk. "We think George is missing. We believe a creature took him." "What? How do you know we saw a creature?" "George sent us a message. He said he needed help. Then, his mobile went dead. We're here to look for him." "Now?" Sylvia asked, surprised. "Yes, now." Everyone picked up their backpacks and turned on their torches. They were ready to go and look for George. They left the house and formed groups. Sylvia stopped for a moment at the door. She stood there for a while. "I just don't understand," she thought. "George wouldn't go off alone. He wouldn't want to scare me. And why would he send a message to Mum? Why not me? And why are all my friends here, and not his?" She shook her head. Something just doesn't add up. After a moment, Sylvia looked around. She couldn't see the groups. She couldn't see anyone. "Where are you?" she called. "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" Sylvia walked toward the woods. Maybe they're all there, she thought. As she walked, she took a torch from her backpack and turned it on. It was getting dark again. "Where are you all? Is anyone there?" she shouted. No one answered. "I don't understand," she thought. She looked around the dark woods. Suddenly, she turned around. It was better to wait in the old house than to walk in the woods in the dark. Sylvia went back to the house and sat on the old bed again. She waited for a few minutes. No one came. Suddenly, Sylvia heard a noise coming from the kitchen. She got off the bed and walked slowly toward the kitchen, trying not to make any noise. She wanted to see what was going on. Maybe it was her friends? Her mother? She turned on the torch. Then she saw it, the creature. It was very ugly, and it was coming toward her. Sylvia shouted and ran from the house. "Help! Help!" she cried. No one was there. She ran as fast as she could, but the creature was quicker than she was. It was soon right behind her. Sylvia turned to see it. She fell to the ground in a panic. She was really scared, so she started kicking. The creature had her legs. She couldn't get away. Sylvia kept fighting, but suddenly, the creature stopped and stood up. It reached down. It wanted to help Sylvia stand up. What is going on here? Thought Sylvia. Suddenly, Sylvia saw movement around her. All of her friends and family came out of the woods. They had their torches on. But they had something else in their hands too. Candles. And they were singing something. It was a song she knew well. At that moment, Sylvia understood everything. The creature took off its costume. It was her father. "Happy birthday, Sylvia," he said. Then he joined in the singing. "Happy birthday to you." Everyone sang around her. Sylvia didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Dad, were you the creature?" Sylvia asked in surprise. "Was it you this whole time?" "Yes, my love. It was me all along. I had a great time playing the role," he laughed. "Then we planned the party for yesterday, but there was a development at your mother's office. So we had to move the party to today. George came up with a great idea. He suggested we play a trick on you. He did it to get you to the cabin for 2 days." "Really?" "Yes, that was some trick," said Sylvia, looking around. "And where is George?" George came out from behind a tree. He was completely clean and completely safe. "I'm sorry, Sylvia," said George. "We played a pretty bad trick on you. But we wanted it to be a birthday to remember. And you're getting a really great present." Sylvia's father handed her a birthday card. "For that trick? It must definitely be a great gift," said Sylvia, laughing. She opened the card. Inside were several papers. "What is this?" she asked, looking around. Sylvia's friends and family picked her up and carried her to the front of the house. "We bought you this old house, honey," said her mother. Sylvia's father joined them. "We're going to renovate it together," he added. "It's going to be your summer house." Sylvia started to laugh, then cried with relief. George was safe. She was safe. And this crazy old cabin was hers. Finally, Sylvia was able to speak again. "Well," she began, "I want to thank you all for the birthday surprise. And Mum, Dad, I can't believe this house is mine. Thank you." Then she looked at her father and George. "Dad, that was quite a performance. I just want to give the creature one important piece of advice. He is not welcome as a visitor anymore." The group laughed and then sang some more. Then they went into the cabin. It was time for coffee and cake. It was also time for a long rest for the birthday girl.